The power of the algorithm was not widely appreciated in the search business when Google got its start. At the time of the Yahoo-Google deal, Google seemed unlikely to pose a competitive threat to anybody. In its early years, the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was no obvious opening for Google to make its way and find acceptance as the company that would organize the world's information. Yahoo was securely entrenched as the most trusted source for all manner of sundry information and appeared to be fully capable of playing the role well. As a portal, Yahoo was the first place an Internet user would visit online, and the company offered a comprehensive array of services and information that would make its site the last site a user would need to visit. It offered email, classifieds, games, news, sports, weather, stock quotes, and whatever else its curators could think of that would pull visitors in and keep them contentedly in place. If its users felt a need to explore the web, Yahoo provided a guide that was widely regarded as the most authoritative because it was hand-edited by human editors who carefully culled wheat from chaff and arranged the listings for websites into categories and subcategories. But the company's executives did not regard the consistently high quality of its web directory to be a valuable strategic asset. The company accepted the conventional wisdom of the time that a web search was only a minor component of a popular portal. 2 out of 3 of Yahoo's visitors came to it for other features or services. At Yahoo, searching the web could involve 2 separate stages, though the complexity was hidden. In the first stage, after a search term was submitted, Yahoo looked among the subject categories in the web directory that its own editors had compiled. If a search term matched any of its directory listings, the relevant directory entries were displayed. If no match turned up, then the search entered the second stage, when Yahoo sent the term out to a search engine with which it had contracted, which looked among copies of all the pages on the web that it had collected and indexed. The second stage was considered by almost everyone in the business to be uninteresting, a behind-the-scenes service that could be obtained from any of a number of fungible suppliers, among whom there were no clear distinctions. One seemed just as good as the next, and Yahoo changed its suppliers periodically. In 2000, Yahoo decided to funnel Stage 2 searches to a new wholesale supplier, Google. For Yahoo to anoint a 2-year-old firm to supply search engine services was a major achievement for then-tiny Google. The quality of Google's searches was sufficiently superior that it had succeeded in standing out in a crowded field. Google came out on top among 13 search sites covered in a 2000 study of user experiences. Still, Google obtained the Yahoo deal not because its search results were superior to incumbent Inktomi's, but because Google was hungry enough for Yahoo's endorsement that it offered Yahoo the lowest price for the service. After Inktomi lost the Yahoo contract, one of its executives sniffed, "We are not in the business of winning search at any cost." What Yahoo failed to appreciate about Google's potential as a rival was the fact that Google, unlike Inktomi, had a retail presence, its own website where it could attract more and more customers itself by serving up better search results. Only 2 years after Google made its deal to supply search results to Yahoo, Google's market share in the U.S. search business approached that of its patron. Meanwhile, globally, Google had jumped out ahead. By April 2002, Google was responsible for 47% of search referrals worldwide, compared to Yahoo's 21%. Even so, 2 more years would pass before Yahoo realized in 2004 that its arrangement with Google was a colossal blunder. Yahoo belatedly replaced Google's search engine on its site with its own engine in an effort to reclaim control over a function it finally understood as vital to its ongoing success. But by that time, Google had consolidated its position as Search Central. Yahoo has not been able to come even close to catching up with Google. In May 2007, Google's share of online searches in the United States had passed 50%, according to one survey. Yahoo had a 26% share, and Microsoft 10%. Google's share continued to climb. By January 2008, Google had a 58% share, and Yahoo had dropped to 22%. Rick Skrenta, the CEO of news site Topics.net, made a persuasive case that Google's actual share of searches was much higher than market research surveys showed and had passed 70% even by the end of 2006. In early 2007, Skrenta confessed that his data showed that Google's market share was actually 78 to 80%, and he had rounded down to a conservative 70% so as to be believable. When Microsoft bid to acquire Yahoo in 2008, company officials offered the argument that if the two companies were to combine their engineering teams, they would be able to better compete against Google. But it was the quality of Google's engineering team, not the quantity of personnel, that best explains why Google's algorithm was able to produce better search results even when Google was a tiny company. Both Microsoft and Yahoo were slow to appreciate the power of Google's algorithm. In the early years of Google's ascent, Yahoo was held back by its ill-fated decision to rely on human editors. In 1998, Srinivasa Srinivasan, who oversaw a staff of 40 that maintained Yahoo's directory, said that she and her new editors would not be able to keep up with the web's growth even if they had at their disposal unlimited resources. Already, at that early date, they no longer were attempting to do so. They had decided simply to settle for what they chose to describe as the best of what's out there. Of course, how they could be sure they were identifying the best of such a rapidly expanding pool of data was a troubling question. Meanwhile, Google enjoyed the benefits of relying on technology that scaled well. The more data the algorithm crunched, the better the results. The company does not disclose how many web pages the algorithm processes. 8 billion pages indexed was the last number it released in 2004 before it decided not to provide updated numbers. But even by 2000, observers were raving about the apparent superiority of Google's search results compared to others. Danny Sullivan wrote in Search Engine Report, "When I speak about search engines to groups and mention Google, something unusual happens to some members of the audience. They smile and nod in the way you do when you feel like you've found a secret little getaway that no one else knows about. And each time I speak, I see more and more people smiling and nodding this way, pleased to have discovered Google." Google also put ever greater distance between itself and its rivals by developing a more sophisticated algorithm for choosing which advertisements should be displayed on its search results page for a given search term. Google used an auction mechanism to let sponsors bid, setting the top amount that they would be willing to pay for every click. This could have been easily duplicated by any of Google's competitors. What Google added, however, was a twist that turned out to make its advertisements far more lucrative than those at any other search sites. An algorithm analyzed a sponsor's history to determine the likelihood that a particular advertisement would attract clicks, and it gave the most prominent positions not necessarily to the highest bidder, but to the sponsors that statistically had the most likely chance of producing the most revenue for Google, taking into account the expected number of clicks as well as the amount paid per click. The more searches that Google was asked to perform, the more historical data it collected about the effectiveness of its ad inventory, and the more accurate its prediction model became. Thanks to Google's algorithm, which no one in the industry could duplicate, Google earned far more for each search than everyone else did. Microsoft, burdened with the belief that no company knew more about writing software than it did, was slow to notice Google's software prowess. The notion that a company like Google, with far less experience, could develop search software that was more sophisticated than Microsoft's was inconceivable. It was embarrassing when a blogger noted in 2004 how superior Google search results were to Microsoft's. A search for Microsoft blog on Google led straight to the employee blogs at Microsoft. But the same search on Microsoft's own MSN service led instead to the blogs of reporters at Seattle's daily newspaper, which happened to contain frequent mention of the word Microsoft, and confused the search engine's algorithm. This was especially embarrassing because the blogger who publicized the superiority of Google's search results was Robert Scoble, a Microsoft employee, writing on a Microsoft blog. Microsoft's executives did not spike Scoble's remarks, but Google's commanding share of web search rankled. The defection of Microsoft developers to Google was also upsetting. In 2004, when Mark Lukowski, one of Microsoft's most highly decorated software developers, met with Steve Ballmer, Microsoft's CEO, to tell him that he was resigning and joining Google, Ballmer did not receive the news of the loss kindly. According to an affidavit filed later in a lawsuit involving another Microsoft employee who left to work for Google, Lukowski recalled that when he told Ballmer of his resignation and acceptance of an offer with Google, Ballmer threw a chair across the office and vowed to bury Google's Eric Schmidt. In Lukowski's presence, Ballmer also threatened. Here, the San Francisco Chronicle used strategically placed hyphens to avoid having to paraphrase Ballmer's language. "I'm going to effing kill Google." When Microsoft Chairman Bill Gates was asked by reporters at the 2004 World Economic Forums at Davos, Switzerland, about what he thought of Google, he was more polite than Ballmer. Gates heaped upon Google some of the highest praise he could think of. The high level of IQ that Google had collected reminded him of Microsoft 20 years ago. In the search competition, he granted that they kicked our butts. But in his view, Microsoft had done a good job on the most common queries that comprised 80% of all searches. Its mistake, he explained, was not paying attention to the more obscure topics, because that's where the quality perception is. He smiled broadly, predicting that Microsoft would soon pass Google in innovations and catch up. Microsoft managers encouraged employees to use MSN's search engine and also to click on its ads, rather than use Google and send money to its principal competitor. Adam Barr, a software developer at Microsoft who maintained the tartly titled blog Proudly Serving My Corporate Masters, wrote in 2005 that, in general, trying to strong-arm employees to use the company's products does not solve the product's deficiencies, which are all too apparent if employees do not freely choose to use the home team's service. Barr also did not accept the "don't send money to our competitors" argument. "Shoot, we own like 3 iPods and an iMac. I use CorelDRAW for editing. I buy books by various competitors of Microsoft Press, not to mention publishing with one. Heck, I run Firefox as my browser, although I guess that doesn't involve money. Anyway, I probably make dozens of decisions every day that indirectly affect Microsoft's bottom line in a small way. Does the airline that I'm making reservations on use Microsoft for its back-end servers? Does that restaurant run Windows on its cash registers? Is all the Microsoft software at my doctor's office properly licensed? Who knows? Yes, I'm an employee and a shareholder of Microsoft, but I'm also a consumer, and I feel free to exercise my right to dispense my money or my eyeball impressions as I want." Barr was willing to accept the suggestion that employees use MSN's search if it was couched as a nudge to give it another try and see improvements. The first comment posted on his blog, however, was by another Microsoft employee, Adam Hersher, who did not see MSN's search as ready to go head-to-head with Google's. Hersher wrote, "I'd venture to say that Google's end-to-end user experience blows MSN's out of the water," and then followed with a detailed comparison. He concluded, "For what it's worth, I try to use MSN services as much as possible, but until there's parity with Google, i.e., as long as Google provides a better service, I'm going to continue to use Google, and it's probably better for Microsoft if I do." The next year, in April 2006, Microsoft hired an outsider, Stephen Berkowitz, to head its Internet division and lead the improvements that the company hoped would reverse the sliding fortunes of its search service. MSN, as the home of the enormously popular Hotmail email service, had 110 million unique visitors a month and was the second most visited family of sites in the United States. Yet the visitors steered clear of MSN's search service. In March 2005, MSN held a paltry 16% of the search market, but a year later, when Berkowitz was appointed, it had slipped to 13%. At the end of 2006, Berkowitz, who had been the CEO of another search service, Ask Jeeves, later rechristened Ask, spoke with candor about the quandary he faced. Counting up all users of MSN's various web properties and services around the world produced an astounding total of 430 million people. Yet, a very small subset of them use our search, he said. My number one strategy is to keep these people from leaking. If Google's high level of IQ created an algorithm that Microsoft's engineers could not yet match, then Microsoft could try something entirely new. Attempt to depict the lack of a powerful algorithm as an advantage, a sign of the company's human touch. Under Berkowitz, Microsoft attempted to turn the tables and promote a new tagline in its advertising: Algorithm, meet humanity. In full-page advertisements that ran in the Wall Street Journal and other newspapers in fall 2006, Microsoft tried to spin its deficiency this way. Let us state the obvious. We're late to the game, we admit it. But instead of shrugging our shoulders and becoming a footnote in search history, we've decided to write a few new chapters. The ad copy depicted the algorithm in the most negative way as a complicated mathematical equation that produces results that somehow needed additional interpretation so that we can all understand. To bolster its argument, Microsoft added to its search results some new whizzy features like bird's-eye views of images and live traffic information, which provided something more human. The strangest part of this pitch was when Microsoft came close to making the argument that it was better equipped to compete against Google precisely because it was not encumbered with Google's high level of IQ. The Microsoft ad boasted that its latest features improving the presentation of search results were created by our people, some of whom didn't even pass calculus. Imagine that. Microsoft also tried something else. It opened up its checkbook and offered to pay corporations to use its search service. Unlike the Algorithm Meet Humanity advertising campaign, the Microsoft Service Credits for Web Search was not publicized by Microsoft. John Battelle's search blog broke the story, and as the details of how Microsoft had been reduced to paying customers to use its service were extracted, Microsoft came off looking desperately afraid of Google's algorithm. In response to a flurry of criticism in the press, Microsoft put Adam Sohn, Director of Global Sales and Marketing for Windows Live, on the line to answer reporters' questions. There was not much he could say, however, to cast Microsoft's attempts to literally buy customers in a positive light. The best thing he had to offer was this wan bromide. There's always controversy when anyone tries something new. Microsoft's reputation and pride were hurt, but more important, it failed to slow the steady enlargement of Google's power in many domains. In search, Google continued to expand its market share. In newer areas, such as YouTube's video, Microsoft had nothing comparable. And in Microsoft's own core software business, Google was slowly encroaching with free online services that were direct competitors of Microsoft's Outlook, Word, Excel, and related software. Microsoft did not lack cash. It had more than $21 billion burning a hole in its pocket in September 2007. But the money could not buy it a coherent strategy that could effectively match Google's multifaceted expansion. As for Steve Berkowitz, the outsider who was appointed Senior Vice President of Microsoft's Online Services Group and charged to bring fresh ideas into the organization, his tenure did not last long. He was removed from the position less than 2 years after arriving. Not only has Google trounced its rivals by its reliance on the algorithm, but it has also achieved an extraordinary feat of corporate branding. Its name has become synonymous with searching the web. Googling is now a generic term. The company is now so closely associated with superior search that even when asked, a rival with a better claim to impressive search abilities than either Yahoo or Microsoft tried to brand itself as a Google-class competitor with its own powerful algorithm, the approach backfired. Ask attempted to gain market share by offering the purest form of algorithmic search, and in the spring of 2007, the company launched its The Algorithm Rocks advertising campaign. Television commercials, billboards, and print advertisements were designed to educate the public so that everyone understood that all search engines are not the same and the algorithm they use is important. At thealgorithm.com, Ask gave long, semi-comic explanations of the history of the algorithm, with irreverent discursions. It's a good thing Robert Frost never wrote an algorithm. Buried in its midst, all but impossible to see, was an esoteric lecture on how Ask's algorithm was developed at the same time as Google's, but on a wholly separate track, combining technology developed at two other companies, Teoma and Direct Hit. Alex Bogusky, chief executive officer at Ask's advertising agency, Crispin, Porter, and Bogusky, explained at the time of the campaign's launch that algorithm is a funny word that most people do not hear every day, if at all. The advertising that Ask planned for the year-long campaign would attempt to inject the word into the consumer arena. Unfortunately for Ask and its agency, the word had already circulated sufficiently prior to the campaign to attach itself with strong adhesion to Google. 3 months after the campaign was launched, survey results making the rounds internally at Google showed that most members of the general public who had seen Ask's "We Are the Algorithm" advertisements assumed that the "we" referred to Google. The pure algorithmic approach drew a fair amount of criticism from professional observers of the search engine business. Boing Boing's Cory Doctorow argued that the algorithms that rank pages embody the biases, hopes, beliefs, and hypotheses of the programmers who write and design them. Tim O'Reilly pointed out in 2008 that humans figure out how the algorithm works and then game the system, designing commercially oriented pages that attain high page rank and occupy the top spots in search results. He said savvier users learn to deliberately skip to the second page of search results to avoid the spam that is predominant on the first page. At the company's beginning, Google's founders were adamant that the algorithm, and only the algorithm, would determine search results. This approach faced a major challenge in 2004 when users noticed that an anti-Semitic website, JewWatch.com, showed up at the top of Google's results for a search for the word Jew. A petition was circulated urging Google to remove the site from its results. Sergey Brin, who, like Larry Page, is himself Jewish, received many email messages from friends who asked him to personally intervene. Brin said he, too, was offended by the site, but the objectivity of our rankings is one of our very important principles. We don't let our personal views, religious, political, ethical, or otherwise, affect our results. Since then, Google's founders have not relented on sensitive political matters such as manually demoting JewWatch. The company still maintains that the only way to keep human bias out is to let the algorithm have the final say. Peter Norvig, Google's director of research, reiterated the point in 2006, saying Google resisted the temptation to make small adjustments when someone complained about the ordering of search results because we think it's just a slippery slope. Nevertheless, Google has permitted a wee bit of flexibility when the algorithm simply fails in a small number of cases without the injection of some human intervention. For example, a search for O'Reilly produced results that were related to conservative political commentator Bill O'Reilly, crowding out other possible O'Reillys, such as O'Reilly Auto Parts, a Fortune 500 company. Google acknowledged the problem by creating, in such special cases, an exception to the algorithm's rankings. The first page of results for O'Reilly is now subdivided into 3 bands, one for links for miscellaneous O'Reillys, one for O'Reilly Auto Parts, and one for Bill O'Reilly. Brin and Page understood that manually inserting adjustments was an approach that could never be applied on a mass scale. They did accept, however, that humans could serve as quality control inspectors. Google hired human evaluators to judge the relative quality of results produced by variations of algorithmic tweaks. In 2007, Google used 10,000 contractors around the world as quality raters. But their feedback was used for making adjustments to the algorithm itself, and not with search results for a single term. Were Google to permit second-guessing the algorithm and adjusting results by hand after the search, the system would be slowed unacceptably. At Google, achieving scale was paramount, and that required relying upon almost wholly automated processes, Another small exception was its willingness to manually exclude links that users had reported were filled with spam. Yahoo's inability to scale its human-edited directory as the web expanded showed the limitations of a system that relied upon humans. Google was determined to avoid Yahoo's mistakes and to have the ability to grow as fast as the web. Google's algorithms do not transfer smoothly to categories of information other than the web, such as books and videos. The web provides an abundance of internal data, in the form of links, that the algorithm can utilize to make judgments about the quality of the information displayed. Will it be able to master different data that lack similar internal clues? Will Google ultimately need to modify its reliance on formulas and incorporate more human input? Will social search, having users' judgments about the relevance and usefulness of a web page determine its place in the presentation of search results, be able to handle a broader range of information categories than the algorithm can handle well? The potential of the algorithmic model in new applications and its limitations can be better understood by looking closely at how Google has attempted to extend its reach in new projects. In one case, when analyzing current news stories, the results have been decidedly unimpressive. In another, when translating foreign language text into English, the algorithm shows surprising promise. The less promising experiment began in March 2002, when Google decided to try the algorithm out as a replacement for human editors in sorting, clustering, and prioritizing news stories. When Google's managers prepared to introduce the service, there was some internal discussion about the wisdom of relying wholly on software to make decisions about what stories should be placed in the most visible positions on Google's news site. Jonathan Rosenberg, a Google vice president, suggested, "Throw some editors on that thing. We'll have the best news product on the web." But Larry Page vetoed the suggestion because manual solutions don't scale. When Google's news service was formally rolled out in September 2002, it drew upon more than 4,000 news sources. In tiny print on the bottom of the news page was a whimsical note. No humans were harmed or even used in the creation of this page. At the top of a list of frequently asked questions about Google News that the company posed and answered was this one: who edits the Google News homepage? One of the headlines is totally out of whack. The answer: computer algorithms, without human intervention. Google proudly listed the absence of editors, managing editors, and executive editors. No individual decided which stories received top placement, and no political viewpoint or ideology was taken into account. Like the algorithm for web pages, the company said, the algorithm for news stories relies heavily on the collective judgment of web publishers to determine which sites offer the most valuable and relevant information. The company knew kinks in the algorithm remained, so if readers saw odd results, an email address was provided to let Google engineers know, not to manually adjust results, but to help to fine-tune the algorithm. The Washington Post's media critic, Howard Kurtz, paraphrased Google's rationale with sarcastic humor. Who needs reporters? Why spend money on whiny, self-centered 401k-obsessed human beings when you can produce a nice news website with quiet, easy-to-abuse computers? Strictly speaking, Kurtz's criticism at that time was misplaced. It was editors whose jobs were immediately threatened, not reporters. But a few years later, with the newspaper industry in dire financial straits, Google News could be blamed for contributing indirectly to the disappearance of reporters, too. By directing users to a particular news article online, Google News and similar news aggregation sites did their part to nudge newspaper subscribers into reading news on a computer screen, not on paper, and to spending their online time browsing Google News rather than browsing the newspaper's own online homepage. As print subscribers disappeared, so too did the advertisers that had traditionally underwritten the cost of gathering the news. Growth in online advertising on the newspaper's websites fell well short of offsetting the disappearance of revenue on the print side of the business, and layoffs in the newspaper business became commonplace. The algorithm did need fine-tuning. In one case, a corporate press release somehow reached the top of the featured stories on the business news page. In another, Google's affectless algorithm committed a major gaffe on February 1, 2003 that drew negative attention when the space shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry, killing all 7 of its crew members. Failing to detect the magnitude of the event, the algorithm permitted the story to disappear from the news site's main page several times during that day. Other anomalies showed up now and then. Google tweaked its formula and filed patents in 2005 for additions to the algorithm that would take into account many more factors, such as the average story length from the news organization that composed the story, the number of staff members in the news bureau, the volume of visitors to the source's own website, the number of countries that accessed the site, and many others. The results improved and the anomalies disappeared, almost. A 15-year-old New Jersey high school student wrote a fake press release in 2006 that reported he had become Google's youngest employee, and Google News picked up the story without detecting the odor of a prank. In the competition for organizing the news, Google's algorithm faced off against Yahoo's human news editors, but in this case, Google did not win. Its algorithm, improvements and all, never was able to catch up with the quality of Yahoo's news site. Google News was not inferior because of the occasional bad day when the algorithm committed a blunder that a human editor would not. Google News was inferior on its best day, never quite able to match the subtleties that guided the selections over at Yahoo News. Visitor traffic reflected the continuing difference. 4 years after it had launched, Google News drew only 30% of the traffic of Yahoo's news site, which remained the most popular news site on the web. In this case, algorithm met humanity, and humanity won. News, by its nature, did not show off the algorithm's true power to gain sophistication automatically as the size of the dataset grows. In the case of websites, webmasters endow the algorithm that examines web pages with additional smarts whenever they add links on their own pages to those found at other websites. The more pages that Google's crawler collects, the more links are gathered by the algorithm, with which it makes its judgments more authoritative. When it comes to news, however, while the algorithm can make judgments about news organizations, it cannot gather the judgments that millions of others have rendered on each news story as they read it. As a consequence, the algorithm for news does not grow noticeably smarter as the collection of news stories scales up. And news stories are ephemeral, constantly being replenished by new ones, which leaves the algorithm without a baseline of data to work with in observing the clicks of users, so that it could progressively sharpen its judgment. Google News cannot serve as a showcase for the algorithm, but mediocre results in this project have not prompted Google to question the company's founding assumptions. So robust is the algorithm when searching web pages that its comparative failure when applied to other tasks goes largely unnoticed by outside Google watchers. Google enjoys the luxury of running experiments like this without suffering a tarnished image if some do not turn out well. In the case of another project that extended the algorithm into a new area, the results were superior to expectations. This was language translation, one of the most difficult, intransigent problems ever tackled in the history of computing. In this area, Google hired a small group of researchers in early 2003 and let them have a go at what is referred to as automatic translation or machine translation. Their efforts have borne fruit. The algorithm that they have developed is able to accomplish, at least sometimes, translations with idiomatic fluency that is a wonder to behold. It also put to good use the corpus of news stories collected by the more disappointing Google News project. Machine translation was one of the first applications that computer pioneers envisaged in the mid-20th century. In 1953, Howard Aiken, of the Harvard Computation Laboratory, voiced aloud his hope to soon begin word-by-word translation from Russian into English. He thought that conveying meaning accurately would be easy, and literary polish would come as a simple matter of course when the machines became more powerful. The next year, IBM scientists and Georgetown University linguists showed off a machine that produced Russian-to-English translations and began what would become a long tradition in the field of machine translation, of overpromising and underdelivering on the quality of the results. On the basis of only a 250-word vocabulary, the software supposedly handled politics, law, mathematics, chemistry, metallurgy, communications, and military affairs. The press, however, was asked to take this on faith. 6 years later, an IBM Mark I was translating texts, again from Russian into English, reflecting the linguistic preoccupation in the midst of the Cold War, at a reported clip of 1,800 words a minute, when human translators could translate only 2,600 words in an entire day. The translated text needed more than a little polishing. A passage referring to U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers began, "It 30 years flight." By its statement, it is older Lieutenant Air Forces, United States, America. But optimism was in the air, and all that seemed to be missing was syntactical rules to supplement the word-for-word matching. The National Bureau of Standards established a mechanical translation group to do research on how to add understanding of semantics and syntax to solve what was called the water goat problem, a reference to the phrase that frequently appeared in the English translations produced by Machine of Russian engineering papers that used the phrase hydraulic ram. Applied linguistics research improved the quality of machine translation, and one particular firm, Sistran, which was founded in 1968 in Paris, would become the leading supplier of machine translation services to other companies, using linguists to define sophisticated grammars. Language by language, the company added to its offerings of bidirectional translation, extending to 40 language pairs by 2005. When Google wanted to provide its users with the ability to view a web page in a different language than the original, it turned to Sistran for the behind-the-scenes machine translation that would be performed dynamically upon a user's request. The quality of the translation was uneven, and at best, it could convey only the gist of the meaning of the source document. Idiomatic phrasing remained elusive, but that defect seemed to be inherent to machine translation. No algorithm could replace a human translator. Sistran's rules-based technology was merely one form of machine translation, however. An alternative approach, which researchers at IBM in the 1990s had shown to be promising, was called statistical machine translation. Reflecting the movement away from rules-based approaches in artificial intelligence research, it was based not on linguistic rules manually drawn up by humans, but on a translation model that the software develops on its own as it is fed millions of paired documents, an original and a translation done by a human translator, such as a speech delivered in English in the Canadian Parliament and its official French translation. The software looks for patterns, comparing the words and phrases, beginning with the first sentence on the first page in language A and its corresponding sentence in language B. Nothing much can be deduced by comparing a single pair of documents, but compare millions of paired documents, and highly predictable patterns can be discerned, with a particular phrase in one language likely, statistically speaking, to be given a particular rendering in the target language. Statistical machine translation was the approach that Google researchers began to explore in early 2003. Using multilingual documents prepared by the United Nations as the training corpus, Google fed its algorithm 200 billion words and let the software figure out matching patterns between pairs of languages. The results were revelatory. Without being able to read Chinese characters or Arabic script, without knowing anything at all about Chinese or Arabic morphology, semantics, or syntax, Google's English-speaking programmers came up with a self-teaching algorithm that could produce accurate and sometimes astoundingly fluid translations. At a briefing in May 2005, Google publicly discussed its work for the first time. To show what could be accomplished with statistical machine translation and a sufficiently large corpus of translated texts, a headline in an Arabic newspaper was displayed, then 2 translations in English. The first one, provided by rules-based Sistran software, rendered the Arabic as "Alpine White New Presence Tape Registered for Coffee Confirms Laden." The second came from Google's fledgling program, which produced a different translation. The White House confirmed the existence of a new bin Laden tape. Google's translation algorithm, which looked impressive at a controlled demonstration like a press conference, turned out to stand up well to independent testing. In fact, it did exceedingly well. In 2005, Google entered for the first time the annual competition for machine translation software run by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which drew researchers from university, corporate, and government laboratories, as well as commercial software vendors. Google placed first among 11 international entrants in Arabic to English translation. IBM placed third, and Sistran seventh, and also placed first among 16 entrants in Chinese to English translation. IBM placed sixth, and Sistran 12th. Not a shabby showing for the rookie. The basic statistical measure in these kinds of competitions is derived from a comparison of a translation produced by the machine against a reference translation produced by human translators that serves as the gold standard. A score from 0 to 1 indicates how closely the machine's translation matches that of the human's, a 1 indicating a perfect match. The scoring is a straightforward counting problem and is done automatically by evaluation software, eliminating subjectivity. The same software has been used outside of competitions too. Researchers can tweak an algorithm, feed test documents in, and instantly see whether the change results in measurable improvements in the quality of translation. Google not only built up a translation model using bilingual parallel texts, it also used software to create a monolingual language model to help provide fluent rephrasing of whatever the translation model produced. The algorithm taught itself to recognize what was the natural phrasing in English by looking for patterns in large quantities of professionally written and edited documents. Google happened to have ready access to one such collection on its servers, the stories indexed by Google News. Even though Google News users were directed to the websites of news organizations, Google stored copies of the stories to feed its news algorithm. Serendipitously, this repository of professionally polished text, 50 billion words that Google had collected by April 2007, was a handy training corpus, perfectly suited to teach the machine translation algorithm how to render English smoothly. When you are in the business of organizing the world's information, what is learned in one domain often finds practical application in another. If Google's statistical machine translation project benefited by the work of other departments under Google's roof, it returned the favor in various ways. The statistical techniques used to develop a monolingual language model turned out to be a convenient way of developing spell-checking software for any language, including celebrity names that appeared only recently, and all without the need to use human editors or even dictionaries. Feed the algorithm a sufficiently large quantity of published text, and the correct spelling is determined by statistical analysis of frequency of occurrence. Progress in the research at Google was also greatly helped by the computing infrastructure that was at the disposal of the research group. A dataset used by many academic researchers in the field, supplied by the Linguistic Data Consortium, contained 5.2 billion words. Google could handle much larger sets, however, such as the 2 trillion words of monolingual text that it pulled from the web pages it had indexed. "We don't have better algorithms," Google's Peter Norvig said. "We just have more data." To find the best translation for a single sentence, Google's algorithm searched 1 million possible phrase combinations. Hard drives were not a practical medium for keeping the data handy for rapid consultation. Only random access memory was suitable. Vast quantities of RAM were needed, and vast quantities were what Google had on hand. Statistical machine translation was well suited for computing that was distributed across thousands of machines, and Google's data centers, though originally built for other purposes, were equipped to handle the computational load. Having a computing infrastructure on hand that could handle computational problems of any scale gave Google's researchers an enormous advantage over others. The rapidity of their progress was reflected in Google's placing so highly in the National Institute of Standards and Technology's machine translation competition in 2005, and then, in the 2006 competition, holding its leading position. Google again placed first among 22 entrants in overall scores for Arabic to English translation, and second among 24 entrants in Chinese to English, edged out by the University of Southern California's famed Information Sciences Institute. Dimitris Sabatakakis, Systrand's chairman and chief executive officer, could not grasp how statistical machine translation could produce results superior to his rules-based technology. After the 2005 competition, he had defended his rules-based approach in a manner that suggested Google, in claiming that it did not use native Chinese speakers, had somehow pulled off a sleight-of-hand trick. At Systrand, if we don't have some Chinese guys, our system may contain some enormous mistakes. He did not understand how Google, without those Chinese speakers double-checking the translation, had beat Systrand so soundly in 2005. But he did not sign up for an immediate rematch. Systrand disappeared from the competition in 2006. No competition was held in 2007, so whether Systrand has decided permanently to avoid direct comparison with statistical machine translation is not yet clear. Google did not claim to have the most sophisticated translation algorithms, but it did have something that the other machine translation teams lacked: the largest body of training data. In 2007, Franz Hoch, the Google engineer who oversaw the company's machine translation research, said, "There's the famous saying in the natural processing field, more data is better data." That was why Google was using those 2 trillion words of text that had been pulled from web pages. The quality of the writing could not be vouched for, but the sheer mass of additional data led to measurable improvements in the translation algorithm. Google's achievement in machine translation cannot be said to have paid for itself yet. One of the most perplexing aspects of Google's expansion of services is that so many of them contribute nothing, at least not directly, to the company's bottom line. So far, machine translation is a case in point. Google has not rushed to put its machine translation capabilities into commercial use. Its machine translation team is a part of Google Labs and is focused primarily on research. On an experimental basis, the group in 2007 supplied users of Google's web search service with the ability to obtain English translations of text from 3 source languages: Arabic, Chinese, and Russian. As far as Google's translation work has progressed, its results are far from polished and idiomatic. When Sarmad Ali, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal who is bilingual in English and Arabic, tried out the Arab-English online translation services of Google, Systrand, and 2 rivals in December 2007, he produced a catalog of syntactic and semantic errors for all of them, ranging from the merely too literal to the laughably bad. Speaking about the machine translation results at a public talk earlier that year, Google's Oak presented Google at its best, the organization trying to make information more universally accessible without any visible concern about its own commercial interests. If any in the audience wanted to try their own hand at building a machine translation algorithm, he said, Google was glad to help. Working with the nonprofit Linguistics Data Consortium, hosted by the University of Pennsylvania, Google had begun to supply, for the nominal cost of shipping, a set of DVDs containing the basic training data needed, listing the frequency of various word combinations from 1 to 5 words in length, technically referred to as pre-counted n-grams, for 1 trillion words of English-language documents that Google's crawler had collected from the web. Statistical machine translation depends upon parallel texts for feeding the algorithm. Oak said that about 100 million words of parallel data are needed in order to build a system that produces reasonably acceptable results. This dependency upon parallel texts limits the number of language pairings available for machine translation. At present, there are not enough twin texts to create a system to go directly from Greek to Thai, for example, so a bridge language, like English, must be used in the interim. Whether machine translation will ever be able to directly translate texts in any language into any other, or whether a different approach, based on understanding linguistics and building an intermediate meta-language, will be needed, is a question that has not been answered definitively. So far, it appears that, with sufficient quantities of data, impossible tasks become possible. Google's progress, which was startling in its speed, gave reason for optimistic expectations. Its Statistical machine translation offerings grew from 3 source languages in the spring of 2007 to 13, and then to 23 within a single year. The company offered not only non-English to English translation, but also translation between any pairing of its languages, which by May 2008 were Arabic, Bulgarian, Chinese in both simplified and traditional characters, Croatian, Czech, Danish, English, Finnish, French, German, Greek, Hindi, Italian, Korean, Japanese, Norwegian, Polish, Romanian, Russian, Spanish, Swedish, and Portuguese. The machine translation project illustrates the way Google is driven by the maxim, more data is better data. In the information business, completeness, both within a category of information and across categories, is crucial because ever more data makes the algorithms ever smarter, which in turn serves to increase the distance between Google's leading position and its rivals. Google's free phone-based information service, 1-800-GOOG-411, offers a good illustration. The service uses voice recognition software to receive queries about phone numbers for local businesses. The service does not collect a service fee, nor does it carry advertising. Google's Marissa Mayer confessed in an interview in October 2007 that she is skeptical that it will ever become a profitable business. But she is not concerned because Google offered it to collect phonemes, not profits. She said, "We need to build a great speech-to-text model that we can use for all kinds of different things, including video search." Google's speech recognition experts told her, "If you want us to build a really robust speech model, we need a lot of phonemes, people talking, saying things, so that we can ultimately train off that." More data is better data. Google knows that the algorithm does not produce flawless results, but rather than view the algorithm's inadequacies as the inherent limitations of a fully automatic process, the company views them as the result of insufficient data and still incomplete tweaking of its inner workings. The company is determined to feed the algorithm ever more information, which it must look ever further out to obtain. It has reached out to claim as many books as it can get hold of, as many videos as its users would like to submit, as many different kinds of maps as can be overlaid upon the earth and the sky, and as many of the documents that computer users routinely create for home, office, and school. Some of these additions to Google's information storehouses may appear to be peripheral to its core interests in web search and associated advertising. Some may appear to be improvident experiments. Some may appear to offer a service that is both highly popular and utterly lacking in revenue production. They may or may not turn out to be important to Google's future. Each one has its own story. They all, however, share a common theme: Google's zealous pursuit of new categories of information, which has not slowed or wavered, even when its public image has been damaged by controversy arising from its actions. When each story of expansion is examined closely, the smooth facade of Google the monolith gives way, and a more complicated picture of on-the-fly decision-making emerges. The official corporate culture, which places a premium on the initiative of individuals and small teams, can be seen in these stories. But there is also an unexamined confidence that the interests of Google and those of its customers are in complete alignment, and every new service is seen by Google as an advance for humankind. Someday, when the experiments have run their full course, they may be seen as the masterful fulfillment of Google's mission to organize the world's information, as far-sighted vision. Or, alternatively, the same stories may one day be read as accounts of misspent resources, evidence of hubris. Chapter 4. Moonshot. The web was merely the place to start. During a talk that Larry Page and Sergey Brin jointly gave at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco in 2001, when Google was 3 years old, the co-founders explained that as large as Google's index seemed, to the layperson, having grown to 1.3 billion pages, the web itself covered nothing but a fraction of information that should be encompassed. Page explained, "Right now, you can only access the stuff that's on the internet. You can't access content that's in libraries. You can't access magazines. You can't access newspapers in general or old newspaper content. You can't access all the television programs that have ever been broadcast, but all these things will happen. The digitization of traditional print media had begun long before. While a graduate student, Page himself had worked on projects funded as part of Stanford's Digital Library Project. And in 2001, it was not clear whether Google would have to do anything to hurry the process along. Libraries, publishers, and broadcasters could be expected to take care of the chores of digitization and place the files on servers that were publicly accessible, and Google's crawler would index their contents just as it indexed web pages. 1 year later, however, in 2002, Page, Brin, and their Google associates decided not to wait and began to investigate undertaking on their own the digitization of the one category that, more than any other, most fully recorded humankind's understanding of the world: books. The Google algorithm excelled at comparing the presumed authority of one web page to another, but it could not warn a user when the best information available on the web was inferior in quality to that found offline between bound covers. Digitizing books was a project that presented challenges wholly different, however, from those entailed in indexing and ranking web pages. Converting books into digital bits involved computer science less than it did other areas of expertise, such as mechanical engineering, designing imaging equipment, diplomacy, obtaining the cooperation of the largest repositories of books, university libraries, logistics, hauling books to scanning centers and back without mishap, and legal expertise, ensuring that the effort did not run afoul of copyright law. It also required a financial commitment unlike any the company had made before. Google set out to digitize not merely the books in a single large library, or digitize the most academically valuable books, or the most commonly used books, or the most critically acclaimed books, but instead all books, every single one of the 32 million listed in WorldCat, the union catalog encompassing 25,000 libraries around the world. Every book. Period. Marissa Mayer would later refer to Google Book Search as our moonshot. The image is apt, at least in some ways. Digitization of all books had been a dream of many. It was widely considered too ambitious to be attainable in the short term. Similar to President John Kennedy's famous challenge in 1961 to safely land a human on the moon by the end of the decade, Google set a 10-year timetable to achieve its goal. In September 2007, Google funded another moonshot, the $30 million Google Lunar X Prize. Before Google's book project began, however, the company had taken the first step in digitizing content that was not already online when it quietly began the year before to scan catalogs supplied by merchants. The catalogs were placed online and could be searched at a Google site separate from the main search site. No attempt was made to assemble the most comprehensive possible collection. Merchant participation was wholly voluntary, and not many elected to participate. Google Catalogs Beta did not give Google experience in high-volume scanning. In 2002, when Page and Mayer began talking about having Google scan books, the two ran an experiment to see how much time scanning a book would take. The story that would be retold later on many occasions was that the two turned the pages of a 300-page book, one by one, according to the cadence ticked off by a metronome. The two supposedly extracted a single but very useful datum from this exercise: that 40 minutes would be needed to scan a 300-page book. From this, they somehow believed that they could estimate the cost of scanning millions of volumes and arrived at a number that fell within the range of the imaginable. Whether the experiment's results were treated half as seriously as the company legend claims seems dubious, at least from the perspective of the present, when Google will not divulge any details about how it captures the images of book pages. It is possible that the experiment led immediately to the conclusion that scanning bound books, which requires a mechanical arm to move back and forth, was hopelessly slow, and a decision was made to use instead a digital camera to capture a pair of facing page images in a fraction of a second. When Adam Smith, a product management director who oversees the Google Book Search project, was asked in 2007 whether Google used a scanner or a digital camera, he said, "Isn't it the same thing?" The difference may seem slight, but it could mean the difference between a project that would be too slow and thus too costly to be feasible, and one that would not be. In 2002, when Larry Page visited his alma mater, the University of Michigan, and met with university officials, he told University President Mary Sue Coleman that Google would be able to scan every one of the university library's 7 million volumes in just 6 years. At the time, the university estimated that if it used only its own resources, the task would require 1,000 years. Google was a privately held corporation whose stock was not yet trading publicly, but whose owners, the founders, the venture capital investors, the early employees, were bound together in a profit-seeking enterprise. Google executives did not view book digitization as an eleemosynary project. They were not contemplating donating funds to nonprofit organizations like the University of Michigan that had already begun digitizing books. Instead, they were looking at the feasibility of Google performing all of the digitizing itself and then using the digital copies for its own purposes. Even if Google Book Search did not produce immediate profits, the project would be expected at some point to yield a return to Google that was proportionate to the outsized investment that the company would have to make to pursue the project. The prospect of being able to search the contents of books with the ease of navigating the web was, without doubt, an exciting one. Having a single profit-seeking company erect the digital doorway to all the world's information that resides in books would, however, when publicly unveiled, not please all onlookers. Google's moonshot differed from NASA's manned lunar landing in another respect. Google had no close competitors willing to match its spending on book search. In the 1960s, space exploration was an extension of the Cold War, and the United States and the Soviet Union were evenly matched in a number of scientific fields. In 2002 and 2003, however, when Google quietly began work on its book search project, no other company was willing to compete with it head-to-head. The investment that the project appeared to require was sufficient to scare off all others initially. Google had the chance to jump ahead not only because of its own fiscal boldness, but also because others who had tried to digitize the world's books had not gotten very far. The first significant project to take on the daunting task was Project Gutenberg, started by Michael Hart in 1971. This was so early that digitization then had nothing to do with scanners and personal computers, which had not yet appeared, but instead relied upon keyboards connected to mainframes, like the one to which Hart had access, which was owned by the Materials Research Lab at the University of Illinois. Hart sought volunteers who also had access to institutionally owned computers and had time on their hands, and would be willing to type in the complete texts of important works of literature that were in the public domain, their typing fingers restoring the old anatomical meaning of digit to digitization. The appearance of personal computers subsequently made it possible to pitch the call for volunteers broadly. Project Gutenberg eschewed the notion of authoritative editions and welcomed texts that were 99.9% accurate in the eyes of the general reader. It was not well along in covering the world's literature. By 2002, the project had digitized only about 6,300 works, all of which were entirely in plain text, without an image of the original typeset pages. Project Gutenberg's goal of making printed works more widely accessible was a noble one, but one of its inherent limitations was its assumption that a reader neither needed nor wanted anything but plain text, stripped of font variations, running heads, and the subtle design features in a printed book that also informed the reading experience. The one institution in the traditional book world that had been arguably best suited to take on the massive task of digitization of all books was the Library of Congress. By 1990, advances in scanning technology had brought digitization costs down to the point that the library began a digitization program that experimented with digitization of just about every medium but books: documents, moving images, sound recordings, photographs. The primary focus was limited to building a digital American memory collection of historical materials. The most ambitious book digitization project was begun in 2001, when Carnegie Mellon University received a $500,000 grant from the National Science Foundation for the Million Book Project, a digitization effort that attempted to get the most books digitized for the fewest dollars by shipping them to India and China to be scanned. When U.S. libraries were asked to lend their book collections to the project for the greater good and subject the books to the vagaries of shipment by sea in cargo containers, the libraries balked for understandable reasons. Brewster Kahle, an Internet entrepreneur who had founded the Internet Archive in 1996, stepped forward to prime the pump, as he phrased it, with a donation to the project of 150,000 deaccessioned books that he purchased for $50,000 from the Kansas City Public Library. The Million Book Project raised another $2.5 million from the National Science Foundation and would eventually surpass its original target, digitizing 1.4 million books in China, India, and also Egypt before its termination in 2007. Most of the books were in Chinese, Indian, Arabic, French, and other languages than English, and supplied by university libraries outside the United States that were also performing the scanning. It was an experiment whose multinational model failed to pick up self-sustaining momentum. While Google was quietly sending out fact-finding teams in 2002 to investigate the feasibility of scanning all books, Brewster Kahle was talking up the same goal, imploring the Library of Congress to digitize all 20 million of its volumes. In a talk that Kahle delivered at the library in November 2002, he lyrically described how the idea of universal access to all human knowledge has been a dream through the ages, arguing that the ancient library of Alexandria had succeeded in gathering human knowledge in one place. Now, he said, the Library of Congress could match and exceed Alexandria, making the contents of all books universally accessible by digitizing them. Kahle was a gadfly, possessed by the idée fixe, so excited that he minimized obstacles that stood in the way of the vision's realization. He casually asserted that the entire Library of Congress's book collection could be digitized for merely $100 million. Kahle did not explain how he arrived at this back-of-the-envelope calculation, but he had to assume that the Library of Congress would happily ship off its entire collection for scanning to Hyderabad, India, the destination of the books Kahle had purchased in bulk in Kansas City. When Google's team in 2002 looked at the experiences of prior book digitization projects, it learned that cost ranged anywhere from $10 to $100 a book, depending on many factors. If one were to use $50 as an average figure and aim to digitize the 30 million unique book titles worldwide, the arithmetic yielded a daunting number, $1.5 billion. Google at the time was growing fast, jumping from $15 million in losses on $19 million in revenue in 2000 to profits of about $100 million on $440 million in revenue in 2002. This was heady growth. Given its size then, however, a $1.5 billion price tag on book digitization was simply too large to be financially feasible. The company decided that it could afford to undertake the book digitization project only because Page and his associates assumed that if they applied their attention to the problem, they would be able to devise a way to obtain images of book pages at far less cost than everyone else. The approach that Carnegie Mellon's Million Book Project was using, shipping books overseas to take advantage of low labor costs, was never seriously considered. Another possible way to eliminate labor costs was to rely on robotic scanners, but what would be saved in labor costs would be dwarfed by the capital investment. The Google solution to the problem of high costs for digitization was to sort books into two categories, those that were still in print and those that were not, and process them accordingly. If publishers were willing to assist Google, the in-print books could be digitized inexpensively. Publishers could submit the same digital files used to typeset the books electronically, though in many cases these files could not be used because many of the codes used for page elements were not standardized. In such cases, Google could digitize a bound copy of the book quickly and without incurring much expense, by taking advantage of off-the-shelf technology that is called within the book trade destructive scanning. The book binding is chopped off and the pages shoot through a sheet feeder into a high-speed scanner. This was the easy part. Not so easy would be digitizing, non-destructively, the 90% of books that were no longer in print. Google devised an approach that combined diplomacy to borrow books gratis from the leading research libraries in the West, ingenuity in devising its own speedy workflow technology for collecting digital images of the printed pages, and low-wage temporary workers to perform the labor-intensive work of turning pages. The human touch was literally visible in some images. Fingers can be seen holding the book in place. Google did not disclose how successful it was in squeezing costs out of digitization, but Daniel Clancy, Google Book Search's project manager, told a Stanford audience in 2006 that a $1.5 billion project is not a cost that would be acceptable. Other companies that were digitizing books spoke of a cost of 10 cents a page. If Google's costs were similar, and a 300-page book cost $30 to digitize, then its stated ambition of digitizing 30 million volumes suggested a total cost of the project in the general vicinity of $900 million, still a staggering sum. The costs were not likely to go down by much because this was a labor-intensive project already using the least expensive labor that the market supplies. Moore's law, which predicts that the number of transistors that could be placed on a chip would continue to double at regular intervals and enables Google's data centers to halve costs every 18 months or so, did not apply to the speed of human page turners. Nor did book digitization benefit from scale effects. The time required to photograph or scan each page is unaffected by the volume of books being processed in the warehouse. Significantly, Google eschewed the easiest way of reducing its costs, by digitizing only a portion of extant books, those that would most likely prove to be of value to its users. By stating from the outset that it would digitize all books, the company neatly avoided the politically fraught task of selecting which books should be included. Misunderstanding Google's radical intention to exclude nothing, French critics suggested that a panel be set up to ensure that the best of Francophone literature was selected. Google's Clancy answered, "We shouldn't have people trying to figure out that this book is more valuable than that book, so don't spend the resources." Google's decision to shoot for the moon meant it could not be criticized for making ill-considered selections. But it did make the company vulnerable not just to criticism, but also to lawsuits over its inclusion of books that were still under copyright and whose copyright holders had not given Google permission to copy the works. This was an issue with which the custodians of the Library of Alexandria did not have to concern themselves when organizing the ancient world's information. Copyright law in the United States required securing from the copyright holder the right to copy, as the name itself explained. But it also provided permission-free copying of small swatches for fair use that used the material in a transformative way that did not impinge on the commercial value of the original. Google's digitization project did not seem to fit clearly within fair use or clearly beyond it. The company would make a copy of the entire work, which seemingly would be verboten under fair use rules. Then again, Google was not proposing to make the work available to readers. The copy would be used to prepare an index of the contents. One could try to argue that the index was transformative, and the copying done in order to prepare the index was a form of fair use. Google would have difficulty making such an argument, however, if its users found all that they were looking for by using Google's index rather than purchasing the book. If Google could persuade publishers that indexing their books in copyright would lead to increased sales and enlist their blessing for the project, it would be able to move forward without worry of lawsuits. By the time it was ready to approach publishers in August 2003, however, reports had surfaced that Amazon was well ahead of Google and already was in negotiations with publishers to make non-fiction books searchable. Without knowing the details of Amazon's plans, Google invited publishers to send it all their books, either in digital or in physical form, for inclusion in its index. If the publisher was skittish, it could send just a few books, and if it was not yet ready to send full texts, then a brief excerpt from the jacket copy, or the book's introduction, or the author's biography would be acceptable. Google offered to place Buy This Book links to major online book retailers like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Books A Million on the book search results page. Google would provide the links gratis and asked nothing in return if a user used a link to make a purchase. Amazon broke the trail for Google, soothing publishers who were concerned that hosting digital copies on Amazon servers increased the risk of piracy. In cases in which book sales were expected to decline if users could browse their pages, cookbooks, travel guides, and any reference works, the books were not considered for digitization. When Amazon publicly unveiled its new service in October 2003, it could boast that it had enlisted 190 publishers, including Simon & Schuster and Random House, and offered the full texts of 120,000 titles, a number roughly equivalent to a large, well-stocked bookstore. A year after Amazon launched Search Inside This Book, Google was finally ready to unveil its own foray into book indexing, which it called Google Print. Even with the additional time, Google had failed to sign up as broad a roster of participating publishers as Amazon. Random House was one of the holdouts. To publishers, Amazon was a familiar face with a proven ability to sell books. Google was known for selling advertising on the web, but nothing else. Adam Smith, who before coming to Google had been a senior executive at Random House, was recruited, along with others with publishing experience, to help Google, as Smith would later say, talk the talk to publishers. At the same time that Google was speaking with publishers to secure digital copies of recently published books, it was also talking with major research libraries about digitizing portions of their collections, adding the out-of-print works to the publisher's in-print works to assemble, eventually, copies of every book ever published. As praiseworthy as Google's goal was, however, its ambitions led the company to become impatient and make a major blunder. Instead of keeping its publishers' program entirely separate from its program with libraries and being patient with the publishers, it decided to rely on the library collections for access to current titles that it had not persuaded publishers to supply with their blessing and permission to copy. The timetable for the moonshot could not accommodate years of pokey negotiations. Google had hoped to complete its moonshot within 10 years, but even that seemed unacceptably distant. Daniel Clancy would later say that 10 years at Google was equivalent to 50 years at a place like IBM. The idea that this takes 10 years is not something anyone would be happy with at Google.